Okay, so in case you're not sure, just started in the second video. So writing, last lesson, I showed you this. It says lesson 1. That's because I've just copied this from the lesson 1. It's actually lesson 2. I showed you this graph. Now, when you first look at this graph, the first thing you should be doing is going, blue, red. Don't look at male, don't look at female, don't look at the numbers, don't look at the dates, don't look at this. You should be going, whoa, blue's bigger than red. Guess what? That's your number 1 main feature. Really? That's it? Blue's bigger than red? Yeah, that's it. You don't write blue is bigger than red, but when you look at the graph, that's what you see. That's the first thing that you see, is that whatever blue is, without even looking down the bottom there, we know that it's much bigger than red. Okay, and throughout every one of these columns. Now we look down closer, we see full-time education versus part-time education. That's our first feature. We're going to make that comparison. That's one of the first things we're looking at. We have 2 graphs, but each graph has 3 dates and 2 kinds of education, full-time and part-time there. Okay, so that's the first thing you should be reporting. And that's, again, that's how easy the first main feature usually is. Normally the one main feature is so obvious, everybody should report it. But believe me, I've had people that don't. They just say, in this graph, we can see that in 1970 and 1971, there were 1,000 male students studying at the university. This was much higher than the female numbers, where only 700 students were studying at this university. In 1980, we see, and that's how they write straight away. Introduction, boom, that's their first sentence. And again, we might want to report that, you know, here the males were the highest, and then later on we're going to mention that here females were the highest. That's fine, but we're not going to start with that sentence. We're going to start with, when we look at this graph, the first thing that we see, one of the most obvious trends, one of the main features we see, is that blue is much bigger than red. There were many more full-time students than part-time students. Then we're going to compare male to female. Okay, we're going to look at the male students over these 3 years against the female students over these 3 years. Again, in terms of this year, and this year, that goes for both of these, yeah? Full-time. There were many more full-time students in each of these 3 years or periods, yeah? So we need to mention that for both of these, male versus female. At the beginning, there were more male students, but their numbers decreased, and women numbers started lower, but increased to become higher than men by this time. You know, so we're comparing male to female. We're comparing full-time to part-time. And of course, we've compared male versus female for full-time. So now we need to compare male versus female for the part-time. And if you've covered that, you've covered pretty much every aspect of this graph, depending on how much detail you put in each one. Okay, so when you look at the part-time, you can see, well, that's increasing there, that's increasing there. They're both increasing, and then you could talk about the differences in the way they increase. Okay, so for this one, males increase slowly and steadily, starting higher, but finishing with the same number as female part-time students. However, females started very low and increased dramatically between 1970 and 1980. Something like that. Okay. The other one I sent you, a line graph. Again, the first thing we do, don't even look at the numbers on the left. I just kind of move back. Don't focus my eyes. I don't look at this title here. I don't look at these numbers. I don't look at these dates. I don't look at what these words say. I'm just looking at those 4 lines. When I look at those 4 lines, blocking everything else, well, there is a fairly clear trend from first, second, third, and fourth. And across time, they're going up, or across from left to right, they're going up. Even before I've even looked at the dates, I can see that there's this clear first, second, third, and fourth throughout the whole time. It doesn't change except maybe at the very beginning here. The gap is quite big between first and second. You know, things like this. These are what I'm looking at when I first see it, before I even know the numbers, the dates, and these words. Okay, and that's how you find the main features. You just kind of look at the picture, the big picture, before you look at the individual details. So again, ranking. The first thing I look at is the ranking. This is always first, this is mostly second and third, and this one's always last. Now, you don't put that as in 4 individual sentences. You'd put that together in one sentence. After that, I would look at the fact that there's been the overall change from here across to here as we've gone across time, that it's increasing overall. I would look at the totals each year. That's kind of connected to this. So I might say that this is like 5, 85, and 70. That's 155 total in millions of tons, whereas here it's 20 plus 40, 60, 120, 220. So the totals in this year are much higher than this year. Okay, so that's something you might look at. Not every graph, by the way, just sometimes that is important. If there's no real major difference or something, you might not need to report that. Oh, by the way, if it goes from here to here with the start and the end are the same, that's worth reporting. If they're just a little bit different, maybe it's not worth reporting. If they're very different, then it's probably worth reporting. Then we might look for similar trends. So once we've reported these things, which look at the overall numbers, we might look at the fact that these two, water and rail, kind of started the same, then did the opposite thing, but then started to both increase here. You might mention that the beginning, all of them kind of showed a fairly similar trend, you know, maybe stuff like that. That doesn't work perfectly with this graph, but in many other graphs it does. Okay, so they're the kind of things you would be looking at there. We will look more at line graphs and column graphs in our next lesson and look at some other main features. So moving on, I want to look at signposting language. Now, at this point, pause your video, read through this on your own if you like. Okay, I really don't want to see you guys reading this and not listening to me. Okay, so if you want to read the whole thing, you can pause it at some point and read the whole thing before we move on. Now, you see our method of introduction. In these charts, we are shown how many male and female students attended a UK university in this year compared to these 2 years. So if you remember from our last lessons, we had our introduction practice. We are shown how many. That's the signposting language. In these charts, we are shown. That's signposting language. Okay, let's look at our next paragraph. What's the signposting language here? Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to look at that. Again, pause the video if you need more time, but you should be able to see here, upon first inspection of this data, it is clear that. Okay, again, that's signposting language there. When you see here, this year compared to this year, that's also sign language. In compared to and So the and compared to, that's also part of the signposting language. Much higher in all periods. That's kind of signposting language. It's making it very clear that it's not just 1 year, it's all years. But the main phrase, and this is one of many phrases you can use, upon first inspection of this data, it is clear. Okay, so that's a phrase you could be using. Let's go down now to the next paragraph, and same thing. If you need to pause the video to take more time to read it, pause it now and have a think. What is the signposting language here? Okay, hopefully most of you found out there, it is this part here. In terms of full, or in terms of, that's it, in terms of. Okay, that's the signposting language. So we're drawing our attention in this paragraph to full-time students. Okay, so you can probably guess a little bit what the next paragraph is going to be about. So again, look at this paragraph. What is the signposting language? Okay, so yes, we see there, when looking at the statistics for. So when looking at the statistics for. Okay, so that would be the signposting language here. Can we see any others? While is a bit of signposting. However, that gives context. While is basically saying this next sentence is going to be the opposite to the previous sentence. So even things like and, but, so, because, these are conjunctions, we call them, the language, but conjunctions are a small part of your signposting language. Okay. However is signposting language. And in the last paragraph, overall is signposting language. Okay. And I should just remind you, for those of you that don't really know what I mean by signposting, a sign is what you would see on the wall. You're driving your car, you're driving your car from Tianjin to Beijing. Along the highway, you see a big sign that says, "Welcome to Beijing." That sign tells me I'm now in Beijing once I go past that sign. Same thing with your speaking, same thing with your writing. This signposting language tells the reader, now we're talking about this. It's important because it makes it clear to the reader what this paragraph is about. It makes it clear, for example, with that while, it makes it clear that this next sentence is going to be a bit opposite to the sentence before. Okay, so males increased steadily, but women jumped quite a lot in that time. Very different trends. Okay, signposting language is making that clear. So let me show you some signposting language. For starting your BP1, lots of different things. Upon first inspection of this data, it is clear that when looking at the total sales of computers in these countries, before describing this process in detail. So again, you can probably tell that this is for maybe a flow chart or some kind of diagram that shows stages, whereas these are more for your regular graphs and charts. Okay, there's not a big difference. There are other phrases you can use, and you might see some other phrases in my sample writing, but I just thought I'd stick with 3 samples for you. Okay, so that's your main feature paragraph. That's the language you should use to start your main feature paragraph. For your BP2, your next paragraph, you might say looking more closely, meaning you're giving more detail about the same thing you gave in your BP1. Okay, that's important. We don't always use this. Okay, that means you've given some general information in your BP1. In your BP2, you're going to start giving details. BP2, now you're going to focus on a specific area. So maybe in BP1, you looked at the total fuel usage or the most common fuels used, if that was the subject. Now we're going to start comparing this country to this country. Okay. So again, we're focusing on a subject. So following on for this one here, before describing this process in detail, and we've described the main features. And don't worry, we'll talk about flow charts and kind of instruction diagrams in, I think, our 4th video lesson here. Okay, then the second BP, the BP2, would go, as for the process, and you would describe this happens first, this happens second. And I've just realized I've got lesson 1 all the time. This is lesson 2. Finally, you should know for conclusion, it's pretty simple. In conclusion, to sum up, overall, there's lots of other language. I shouldn't need to help you with the other language for a conclusion. So starting each paragraph with good signposting language, 1, makes it clearer for the reader. 2, adds to your word count. And 3, means you've got some better grammar and vocabulary. There's lots of reasons to use good signposting language. Okay, so we have here all the different question types. So have a look at those. You don't need to look at the numbers and words, just looking at them, what kind of question types are they? I'm actually going to leave that with you for your homework. and come back to that at the beginning of our next lesson. So that's all for today. Thank you very much once again for listening patiently. And if you do have any questions, send them to us either here on our on WeChat, on our Weixin, or through text message or phone call. Have a wonderful time, and I'll see you for our next video. Bye-bye.